Um, yeah, and also the lecture will take about an hour. After that, there will be a question session. So you are free to write your questions into the Zoom chat that you can see. You can see the button on the lower panel on the screen, probably if you have your Zoom on. And you're free to write not only in English, but also in Russian. The questions in Russian, I will not be translating. I will be reading them to our lecturer as they are. And hopefully he will be so kind as to translate them himself. And then he will be answering those questions in English. So if you're not sure in your English writing skills, but have a burning question, please still do not hesitate to ask. And yeah, with this brief information, I think we can start. So we're starting our lecture series with the lecture from James White, Dr. James White, I'm sorry, a researcher at School of Theology and Religious Studies in the University of Tartu and the Urals Federal University. With this, I'm giving the microphone to James, and yeah, hope we have a great lecture altogether.
Well, thank you very much, Yaroslavna. And of course, I'd like to thank very much Narva City Museum for agreeing to host this meeting this evening. And it's it's an honor, a daunting honor, to be the first lecturer in this undoubtedly wonderful series. I happened to see the series last year. It was truly excellent. So it's a great pleasure for me to be here today to present some of my research. So I just want to give you a brief introduction to who I am. As Yaroslavna correctly said, I'm Dr. James White of both University of Tartu and Ural Federal University here in Yekaterinburg. My major research topic is the history of Russian Orthodoxy in the period of the Russian Empire. Previously, I've written about the relationship between the Old Believers and the Russian Orthodox Church, and this was the subject of my first book, which is called Unity in Faith. You can find it on Amazon if the desire to read it so takes you. But recently, over the last few years, I've been working on Orthodoxy in the Baltic provinces of the Russian Empire. And the research I'm going to present today is part of this bigger, more general research project. And one of the things I've been doing is looking at the encounters of the so-called Estonian Swedes with Orthodoxy, the limited encounters they had. So without any further ado, I'm just going to turn off my video, I think, because maybe you can see all this kind of thing, and then we can proceed.
People in the chat, I'm very sorry, are asking to speak a little bit slower.
Of course.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Apologies. So the first thing I want to do is to set out the context behind this, to look at the island and the people who populated the island. Of course, have a long history, and the small episode we're going to investigate today, which happened in between 1865 and 1867, is very much an integral part of that longer story, stretching back towards the into the medieval past. So let's have a quick look at the island of Ruhnu itself. So this is here I've given you the exact size of the island. It is a very small island, and I'm going to show you a map in a few seconds, which will give you a precise location on where the island is, and we'll discuss why that was important for its economy. So, of course, today the island is part of Estonia. It's off the western seaboard of Estonia, but in the past, This was part of the Russian Empire's Livland province. Of course, the Estland and Livland provinces do not match the current borders of either the Estonian or Latvian republics. These were different, geographically speaking, these were different entities. To get to Ruhnu today is a fairly easy task, a fairly easy thing if you want to do it. It only takes about 3 hours from nearby Pärnu, from a port nearby Pärnu by car ferry, and it's about 3 hours long. But in the 19th century, in the period we're going to be discussing, it was a much longer proposition. In fact, the quickest I found of the people who visited the island at this time was about 30 hours from Kulosaar, so from Saaremaa, to Ruhnu. But we also have priests reporting 7 days, and there was another one who reported 8 days. Basically, the reason it took so long was because the weather could be extremely stormy in the Gulf of Riga. And this stormy weather often played a role in isolating the island from the mainland. Now, one of the big problems for the islanders was, while the island was very beautiful looking, it's beautiful looking today, and it was certainly beautiful looking in the 19th century, but the land was extremely poor and sandy. It was poor in quality. So firstly, there was very little land to go around as agricultural land. And secondly, even that land which was distributed did not produce the best crops and could not produce a lot of crops. And this brings us on to, so right, here we are. So this is what Ruhnu would have looked like on a Russian map in 1855. And you can see one main settlement in the center of the island based around the Lutheran church, about which we will speak in a minute. And here is basically, just in case you're unaware, the location of the island in relationship to the imperial provinces of Estland, Livland, and Kurland. So we can see here as part of Livland and quite some distance off its coast. Now, the islanders were not Estonian speakers, Russian speakers, or German speakers, as was the case in many other parts of the Russian Baltic provinces. Instead, they were Swedish speakers. So these people had been present on the island since at least the early 13th century. There are some people who believe they were there for longer. There were persistent rumors in the 19th and 20th centuries that a Viking longship was buried off the coast on the coast of Ruhnu, precisely because the island location of Ruhnu would have made it a perfect raiding site from which Vikings could launch their attacks into the mainland, but this remains unconfirmed. But these Swedes did not necessarily identify themselves as Swedes, rather they called themselves the Ibo folk, or the island people. And they lived, and they were part, and the ones on Ruhnu were part of a larger grouping that lived all along the border, the coastal borders of Estland province and Livland province into the 20th century, to the Second World War, in fact, when most of them left and departed for Sweden. And by the mid-19th century, there were only 300 or so of these Ruhnu islanders, these Ruhnu Ibo folk. So this was a very small community. And not only was it the weather and the location in the middle of the Bay of Riga that isolated them, it was their language that isolated them. So all of the Ibo folk had dialects in Swedish, which were quite difficult for native Swedish speakers to understand. However, the Ruhnu dialect was one step even beyond this. Apparently, it was quite difficult for even other Ibo folk to understand their very peculiar dialects. And in fact, there was a book, the first vocabulary, the first dictionary was written in the 1880s or 1890s, I forget precisely. But they had an entire volume to describe their dialects, whereas all the other Ibo folk dialects were gathered together in one volume. So it gives you an idea of how distinctive it was, and one way in which they were isolated both from their own kinfolk in the other Ibo folk communities, but also from the mainland provinces of the Russian Empire. Although it should be emphasized that we're going to see it, as we're going to see at various points throughout this talk, clearly they did speak some Estonian and had, through that, had connections with the mainland and its people. So how did these people make money? How did they live? Well, farming was, of course, an essential part of their life, but was rather limited for the reasons I've mentioned. The soil was very sandy and didn't really produce much, and what it did produce was not of a sufficient quality. There were very few farm animals on the island as well, for instance. It was difficult to bring farm animals in or out to allow for that kind of economy. The real place where the islanders got their livelihood, got what they needed to eat and even sell, was at sea. So here they went fishing very frequently. They were very well known as seal hunters. They had a very distinctive method of hunting seals, which was not only to use batons and rifles, but also to hunt them with dogs. They would trade. They could be found in ports across the Baltic space. So you can find them in not only the ports of Livland and Estland province, but also in Finland and Sweden as well. And they also would make money, a bit of side money sometimes, as a taxi trade, taking people from islands in between the Estonian islands, taking them in their small but extremely agile boats on small trips. And so really this was a people who, though their island was very isolated, they were nonetheless people who got around across the Baltic, visiting many different areas, making many different connections with different types of people. Just to give you an idea, there is one case I have from 1832, where Ruhnu seal hunters had a fight involving both fists and rifles with a group of Finns on the Finnish coast, while they were because both groups were competing over the seals available in this particular instant. Now, one major way to make money, and it's going to be of particular importance in this lecture, was through shipwrecks. As we saw on the map, Ruhnu actually sat in the middle of an extremely busy shipping channel between Riga and the northern imperial port of St. Petersburg. So it was a very busy area that became progressively even busier as the Russian Empire's economy developed into the 19th century. It's worth remembering that Riga was one of the biggest cities in the Russian Empire and was very prosperous precisely because it had a booming import and export trade. Now, the shoals around the island, the shallows, were very difficult to navigate, notoriously difficult to navigate. The islanders, with their intimate knowledge of these waters and their boats specifically designed to cross the waters, didn't have many problems. But though for many sea captains coming from further abroad, this could be an extremely dangerous area. And indeed, there were frequent shipwrecks, several times a year, in fact. There could be a large shipwreck on or near the coast of Ruhnu. And this was one way for them to make quite a lot of money, sometimes by simply looting the wreck, but more often by returning the salvage to the island, where it would be picked up by the Russian government for auction, and the Ruhnu Islanders would always get to claim a share of either reward money from the government or a share of the auction money. And this could be a really substantial amount of money. Hundreds of rubles could pass to the island, hundreds or even thousands of rubles could pass to the island as a result of this salvage from shipwrecks. And it should also be noted that they performed an invaluable service to many of the sailors on these vessels by rescuing them, bringing them to Ruhnu, where they could be later picked up and taken to the mainland. So they also something of a primitive, they also served as something like a primitive coastal guard as well. So just to give you an idea of what this looting might have looked like, we have here a first-hand description of of how the Ruhnu Islanders would strip down a wrecked ship. So this is Frederick Joachim Ekman, who was pastor on Ruhnu for a year, Lutheran pastor on Ruhnu from 1841 to 1842. And what he's describing are the Ruhnu people stripping down the wrecked British schooner for James Lewis, which was shipping linseed from Cape Colca to Salamaua. I'll just read this out. It was a pleasure to observe the Ruhnu inhabitants' skill, strength, intelligence, and courage in the salvage. First, they cut down the masts, and they were brought safely to shore with their shrouds, sails, and yards. After this, the real salvage started, a process that took days. Most of the salvagers were dressed in large fishing and water boots, soled with wood so they would not slip on the wooden deck, and so high they reached the loins of the wearers. These were necessary because the waves kept breaking ceaselessly over the wreck. Despite this challenge, the salvagers eventually managed to save everything that could be taken off the wreck. With long tongs, the cabin was emptied of everything they could reach. They even managed to fish up a purse containing a gold ring and silver coins with their gripping, scissor-like, long-shafted instruments. So you can tell this was quite a skilled operation to do this kind of salvaging, often very risky for the Ruhnu Islanders involved. Now, what about government? So basically, from the middle of the 17th century, that is during the Swedish rule over this area of the world, the islanders had effectively come into ownership of the island by themselves. They were effectively they owned the land themselves. This was a quite unique case in the Baltic provinces of the time, where most of the land was owned by the Baltic German landowning class, and the natives, be they Latvians or Estonians, occupied the role of tenants who had to pay rents and had to obey the Baltic German aristocracy in most respects. So the islanders had a significant degree of independence and self-management. Their main institution, the main governing institution, was a medieval Swedish community meeting called the Loinskap, which was basically an irregularly held meeting of all the male heads of households. And this is where they grouped together to discuss issues of importance to the local community on the island. Many people who saw this kind of ancient institution in the 19th century described it with a large degree of disdain. They called it a kind of communism. This was famously in an anthropologist who went to the island in the 1850s, Ruhnu, who described it as a sort of kind of communism. And this criticism is echoed again throughout the later part of the 19th century, precisely because there was no real leader, no particular head of this Loinskap, no real government involvement in it or connection to the government. However, the Imperial Russian government did have some representatives on the island. The main one was, of course, the Lutheran pastor, who we're going to discuss in a few seconds. And the other one was the Lighthouse Keeper, who was there from in the 19th century. And these were both the Lighthouse Keeper and the pastor were outsiders to the island. In the case of the Lighthouse Keeper, they tend to be Estonians employed by the Russian government. And here we can see actually the picture is of the lighthouse that was built just after the events we're going to discuss. So towards the end of the 1860s. Previously, there was a wooden lighthouse, but obviously this was the largest structure on Vormsee. Certainly, you were able to see it from the sea, from the ocean, which really stamped kind of the government's authority on the island. Nonetheless, this kind of idea of independent spirit, of community self-management, was a very strong part of the Ruhnu Islanders' identity, and they fiercely defended their legacy of autonomy from outside interference. So I just thought I'd give you an outsider view on Ruhnu society, what people coming from the outside thought about it. So here we have Pastor Lars Maselli who was the Lutheran pastor of Tallinn's Swedish church. He visited the island in the 1870s, precisely when we're not sure. He didn't date his letter, but here he gives us a view, and I'll just read out again. Here, each man is equal to another in relation to property. Here, everyone is a lord and no one is a servant. In one home, 3, 4, 5, or 6 completely equal householders live together with their families. Here, around one dinner table, sit both the loafers and lazy, and the diligent and assiduous. On the one hand, this is good, as on Ruhnu there are no beggars. But with the passage of time, all the people have become poor beggars thanks to this. What can be said for certain is that complaints are being heard everywhere about growing need. The fact that this beggarly communist institution is harmful and fatal does not need proof. It supports laziness and vice, paralyzing and killing all activity, joy, and desire to work. How can intimate relations between husband and wife exist here, where a man and a woman have no opportunity to conduct a confidential conversation? How can peace exist in a home where 4, 5, or more men and women have the same authority and the right to punish? In these conditions, how can children be raised when they all belong to one home, i.e. to both neighbors and parents? So we see here someone coming from the outside, from the very hierarchical society of the Russian Empire, and especially the extremely hierarchical condition of the Baltic provinces, coming here and really sort of reacting very strongly against the much more communal, the much more perhaps equal or equalistic society that they had on Ruhnu, and certainly reacting with a sort of mix of shock and even disgust. Now, as for religion, so from the mid-17th century and possibly earlier, there was a Lutheran parish church on Ruhnu. This is a picture of it here. It's one of the oldest wooden Lutheran buildings in the Baltic today. So this still exists. The pastor from this time on into the Russian Empire, into the period of the Russian Empire, had both secular and religious duties. So he was not only a spiritual father to the Ruhnu Islanders, but he was also technically the most senior government official on the island. He was in charge of collecting information when the government required it, and of relaying government decrees to the people, for instance. And he was also technically regarded as the custodian of the estate. So remember when I said the Ruhnu people often fiercely defended their autonomy and their spirit of independence from outsiders. Well, often the Lutheran pastor was perceived as such an outsider, as someone who was willing to trample over community rights and into the economic life of the island, which obviously generated conflicts between both pastor and the islanders. Now, in the 19th century, many of these pastors came from one place, which was the city of Turku, Åbo, as it was referred to in the 19th century, in Finland. So these were Swedish-speaking pastors, and the main reason they were recruited there was the Lutheran church in the Baltic provinces obviously did not have like a ready supply of Swedish-speaking pastors, so they had to turn to other places. And this was the town where they recruited. For the Lutheran pastors who went there, this was regarded as an extremely challenging position. For many of them, they complained, for instance, about the quality of the Swedish the Ruhnu people spoke, about the distance between the mainland and the island, and about the difficulty of communications. Indeed, in 1895, I've given you the quote here, the priest Calver complained, in many ways, life here is probably more difficult than in Africa. I think he was saying this something of an exaggeration, but nonetheless, it gives you a perspective on both on this sort of just how remote some of these people regarded Ruhnu as being, and how remote life could actually be on this island. Now, one thing that was we should be really taking into notice, of course, the Lutheran church charged a tithe from the local islanders. That is to say, they had to pay a tax of 1/10 of their income, or in this case, their agricultural produce, to the Lutheran pastor to maintain himself. So, if according to a report from 1866, the 330 people on Ruhnu paid a substantial amount of rye and 1/10 their fish, seal produce, pigs, sheep, geese, ducks, butter, chickens, and eggs to maintain the Lutheran pastor. And they also provided him with 2 servants, a male and a female, who would provide the assistance in the household within the Lutheran pastor's house and on the farm. So obviously there was, this could also be an area where tension was developed. So I'm just going to take a glass of water 1 second before I continue. All right. So here we come to the meat of what I want to discuss today, which is the crisis which occurred here between 1865 and 1867, which resulted in Ruhnu almost converting to Russian Orthodoxy. So it really starts with this man, Pastor Axel Irlander. As I've already mentioned, he came from Tartu, as did most of his predecessors, where he had spent all of his life and previous career in the Lutheran Church. Quite why he went to Ruhnu is unknown. There is some suggestion that maybe he was attracted by the idea of getting money from shipwrecks, which could be, as I said, a really substantial amount of money, and that would, he might get such an amount of money that would set him up which would secure him for the rest of his life. As far as can be told, that when he arrived on the island in 1861, he was regarded relatively favorably by the islanders. At least they don't seem to have announced any problems, and they later said that when he first came, they had no problems with him. Although there is some suggestion in the later investigation, the Ruhnu people had difficulties with the Finnish pastors. Indeed, they asked that they not be sent Finnish pastors anymore. So here we have a quote from one of the islanders from the subsequent investigation. "All of the other pastors loved vodka and mammon like us. The Finns drink everything they don't need. He who does not have his daily crust of bread, they send here to Ruhnu. We have already more than once most humbly asked the consistory to send us a pastor, not from Finland, but from Dorpat or Stockholm. But nothing helped. It was all in vain." So clearly, perhaps there was some tension with pre-existing tension with people from Turku being sent, the pastors from Turku being sent to Ruhnu. Then there came the spark that sort of changed this early favorable relationship completely, which was a shipwreck. And so on the 21st December 1864, the Hanoverian schooner, the Helena, shipwrecked on the coastline of Ruhnu, and it had been carrying flax, a potentially valuable substance, to Riga. And this could be worth, at auction, it might have been worth thousands of rubles, which would be distributed both to Irlander, to the pastor, and among the islanders. So Irlander, as the most senior person on the island, took the usual role of the pastor in these circumstances, which was both to organize the relief effort and then the collection of the salvage. However, at this point, the islanders and Irlander fell out over the collection of the salvage. The islanders basically suspected that Irlander was hoarding the flax himself, was stealing a lot to reduce their share of the overall collection. And he said essentially the same thing about the islanders. So at this point, they started to mutually accuse each other of thieving, of mutual thievery, of stealing from each other. And as we've already encountered, for Ruhnu Islanders, for an outside authority like the pastor to start stealing from them would often be the spark of conflicts. And indeed, the Lutheran report from later on this incident said, "From this time, hatred and bitterness, curses and open falsity grew each day." And then in 1865, another disaster this time for Irlander, the parochial house caught fire and burnt down. So Irlander at the time had a wife and a young son, and they were essentially left without a place to live permanently on the island. However, this was taken by the islanders to simply have been Irlander's way of disguising his theft, to essentially set fire to the stolen flax that they believed was hidden in his house, and therefore conceal his guilty role. We have a record here from 1920, which was recorded by a German anthropologist visiting the island. So the old man who remembered this had been a child when the fire had started in 1865. The same day as the post boat arrived, it was a clear, beautiful day with a mild northerly wind. The pastorate started burning. We children watched from the street as a woman rushed past. Shortly after, a large column of smoke rose from the pastorate. Only moments later, after we had run back home, told our elders, who lay at home resting, and got them back again, the entire farm was engulfed in flames. So after this had broken down, so after the shipwreck, the supposed theft of the flax, and then the fire in the parochial house, Irlander, the relationship between the islanders was already, and the pastor was already quite poisoned. Irlander's response, regrettably, only made things worse, because apparently he demanded that the islanders pay for the reconstruction materials and work on the building process without being compensated for this work. Obviously, he was demanding labor for free and materials for free. So the islanders obviously were not very happy and told him basically, no, we're not going to do this. And in response, he threatened that he would bring in imperial soldiers from the mainland to force them to do it. And their reaction was one of real fear and fright. We get a sense of why that is the case from this quote here, again from Lutheran Investigations in 1867. Or 1867. The order to rebuild the pastoral house came unexpectedly when the younger men had already gone to sea on the hunt for seals. The elderly took this news with horror, and the horror grew still further when they were told they would be compelled to fulfill their debt by soldiers and corporal punishment. So you can see here the young men had gone to sea, and Irlanders sprung the threat onto the remaining elderly and the women of the island when it was going to create the greatest impact and the greatest fright. And just in case it seems like an unrealistic threat, it might not have seemed so at the time. One we should remember, only a few years earlier, 3 years earlier, in 1862, there had been similar disturbances among the Ibo folk community of the island of Vormsey, who had voiced their dissatisfaction with how much their German landlord was charging them, how much he was expecting them to pay for, in rent, and how much work he was demanding from them. In response to this discontent, the imperial government in St. Petersburg had indeed dispatched a company of imperial infantry to the island to suppress the discontent. So it wasn't necessarily an unrealistic threat, and indeed it happened to an Ibo folk community within very recent memory. So what then was the choice of the Ibo Islanders at this point in the crisis? How were they going to evade both problems here, evade the problem of having imperial troops arrive, but also evade having to do work and do services for this man who, by this point, they truly hated? Well, in the 18th century, the islanders had often recourse to violence against the pastor when things got this bad, when their relationship got this bad. But in 1865, 1866, there was another option on the table, and this was precisely Russian Orthodoxy. So Russian Orthodoxy, of course, has an extremely long history in the Baltic provinces, especially in the eastern parts of Estland and Livland. But apart from in these areas, Russian Orthodoxy had been before the 1840s largely the religion of officials, merchants, and soldiers living in city communities. So it didn't have much outreach into the countryside. There wasn't really many countryside churches or countryside priests, or indeed priests who spoke the local languages, Estonian and Latvian. This all changed between 1842 and 1849, when over 100,000 Estonians and Latvians converted to Orthodoxy. Now, there's been much written about this, about why they did so. Basically, we can say here is that they converted to Russian Orthodoxy, which they called the faith of the Tsar, to bring the Russian government into their side during their battles with the Baltic German aristocracy. The argument was, well, if we join the Tsar's faith, Russian Orthodoxy, then the Tsar will necessarily support us. The Tsar and his government will support us against the Baltic Germans when they demand too many rental payments, too much work on their estates, etc., etc. And of course, many rumors flew about, and it was often claimed, and in some cases was true, that the peasants who converted, the Estonians and Latvians who converted, did so because of promises of land, money, and various other benefits. Many also believed that this would be a way of gaining more schools, for instance, was one motivating factor, was often a motivating factor mentioned. And just so we're aware, none of these developments were really isolated from Ruhnu, as isolated as Ruhnu could seem. So, for instance, Kulosaare and Pärnu, the two largest nearby port towns, have both had large historical and administratively important Orthodox parishes, from whence information undoubtedly made from where they could get information. The nearby island of Kinu, which by this point, by the middle of the 19th century, was an exclusively Estonian island, had almost unanimously converted to Orthodoxy in 1847. So all of this means that the conversions were, for the Ruhnu folk, quite close at hand. They were being experienced on their doorstep, so to speak. And certainly many people believe that these conversions happening around Ruhnu had influenced the Ruhnu islanders to convert to Orthodoxy. So here we have Irlander's own comments, and he believed that it was because of Russification, what he called becoming Russified, i.e. becoming Orthodox in nearby regions, had precisely influenced the decision to become Russian Orthodox, to join the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, numerous investigators also suggested that the Lighthouse Keeper, who, if you remember, was a representative of the Russian state, had actually been bringing Orthodox literature into Ruhnu and distributing it among the local people, although quite how literate they were and how able they were to understand it is open to question. And essentially, it was claimed that these books were Russian Orthodox books translated into Estonian. So here there was a potential option to get the support, that they might be able to get the support of the Russian government in their battle with the Lutheran pastor Irlander, if they converted to Russian Orthodoxy, which was the solution they chose. So on the 1st of May, 1866, 20 Ruhnu men visited Archpriest Alexei Veldomovsky in Kulosaare, where they presented a petition to join the Russian Orthodox faith, an act which they repeated almost a month later in June. When they handed in this conversion, they sent the petition, which was in the names of most of the islanders. So they represented the ambition of most of the islanders. At this point, the Veldomovsky reported what was going on to his superiors, which of course was Archbishop Platon in Riga and Governor Baranov in Tallinn, and they suggested that together they should form a joint team, both a priestly and a secular official team, to go and investigate what was going on Ruhnu, to see whether there was any realistic chance that these people wanted to convert to Russian Orthodoxy. Of course, they were skeptical, because these were people who mostly spoke Swedish. And at the time, the Russian Orthodox Church really had very little missionary literature, or indeed literature at all, in Swedish. And so, of course, the question was asked, well, how can these people understand anything about Orthodoxy? And that was one of the main reasons why the investigation was sent. And so you see here a copy of the petition, which was sent on the 1st of May, 1866 to Valdomovsky from the archival file. I think if you look at the kind of symbols which were written to the name, this is quite interesting. So my colleague who works on the Swedish material for this tells me that these were the symbols that were put above homesteads. So these kind of runic symbols were put above homesteads to represent their the particular identity of the house. So now we move on to when the investigators arrived. And they arrived on the 1st of July and stayed with the Lighthouse Keeper, obviously being the main representative of the state. The first action they took, obviously, was to speak to the islanders collectively through their Loenskap, through their collective communal organization. And the Russian official involved, Viktor Polivanov, asked, which language shall I speak to you in, German or Estonian? The islanders replied in Estonian, but the Russians present apparently didn't speak any Estonian, so they used the translator to render their words into Estonian. And what quickly emerged was that around about 145 people at the meeting wanted to become Orthodox, and they together represented most of the 330 islanders. So these were 145 male heads of households. It very quickly became clear to the Russian investigatory team why these strange group of Swedish islanders wanted to join Russian Orthodoxy. And here I've given you as a quote, Polivanov's opinion. The reason why is the strong desire to convert to Orthodoxy. The reason why the strong desire to convert to Orthodoxy appeared precisely now on Ruhnu is mainly down to the commoners' extreme enmity towards the current pastor. Some peasants asked, will the pastor leave their island if they accept Orthodoxy, and how soon? One woman expressed her feelings towards the pastor with the present naive phrase, if this pastor remains with us, then I will now convert to the Russian faith. If he leaves, then I will think more on whether to convert or not. So very clearly, it was enmity towards Irlander, towards the Lutheran pastor, that was motivating this conversion. The Russians knew that the Russian administration, both religious and secular, understood this very well indeed. Nonetheless, it was believed that because most of the population on Ruhnu was converting, they should go ahead with the conversion, despite the fact it was being motivated by very clearly material needs. And so on the 24th of August, 1866, Archbishop Platon ordered Valdomovsky back to Ruhnu to perform the so-called rites of conversion, to perform the rite of chrismation upon the islanders, therefore bringing them officially into the Russian Orthodox flock. However, the Lutherans were not idle during this time. They almost immediately heard about the petition written to the Russian Orthodox clergy on Saaremaa, and sent their own investigators to try and persuade the people to abandon their intention to convert to Orthodoxy. So there was two main trips, one in August and one in September 1866. I just thought it'd be interesting actually just to give you a quote from Karl Masing, who writes about his visit to Ruhnu. It gives you an idea of what it was like to visit the island in 1866. So he writes, due to the shallow waters and rocky shores, there is no harbour on all the island. Our vessel was compelled to put down anchor 1 versta from the coast and wait while the island's residents sent a small boat to bring us to shore. Then a peasant cart took us 1 versta to the village. Every visit to the island, especially of an unknown pastor, is a special event for the curious islanders. Soon we were accompanied by our host, the sexton, and several other men for a walk around a picturesquely disposed village. At its end, we came to the new building of the pastorate, which I attentively inspected. On the way back, I also inspected the romantically placed little Lutheran church. This gives you an idea of kind of how it was to visit the island at this time period. The investigations, so of course, they really wanted to find out precisely why the people wanted to convert to Russian Orthodoxy and what it would take to dissuade them. So I've given you here 2 quotes, which again I will read to you, about what they found out during these investigations. To my question, so this is Mazing speaking, to my question, to those who wanted to convert, do you have anything against our Lutheran church, its teachings or culture? They answered, no, of course not, nothing. To my question, do you like the Greek church, that is the Russian Orthodox Church, its teachings or culture? Do you understand anything in it? They also answered, no, in general, nothing. Only one voice answered, perhaps it is better. They will leave us in peace and will not force us to pay the tithe or build and repair the parochial house. The Russian pastor will receive his wage from the crown, as well as a house and the church, and we will not have to pay him anything. So here you can see they very clearly identify that they don't understand anything about Russian Orthodoxy, its rituals, its doctrines, etc., but they very clearly understand that there's a financial incentive involved in joining Orthodoxy. But they might not have to pay for the house, they won't have to pay his salary, they won't have to pay a tithe, etc. And by the way, that it's not really a very accurate perception, but certainly it seems to be in the perception here. So we have from one of the other visits, one of the other inspections, this is Peterson and Mazzelli quoting one of the islanders. They do not, he continued, even give us a real pastor. He who does not have a position they send to us. And it often happens that they are not our pastors and teachers, but our landlords and commanders. It often happens that instead of sermons, they read to us only about the tithes. If everything is duly paid, then God save you. If not, they threaten us with curses and hell and so on. So here they're clearly complaining about this idea about how the person of a Lutheran pastor unites both government duties and religious duties in one person. So here they find this, they're clearly finding this a burdensome thing, where the pastor's obligation to be a government official distracts him from his religious duties to be a teacher and to be a spiritual father. But in any case, the results of the investigation are quite clear. So by September 1866, Erlander and his young family had left the islands and had gone home to Turku. Indeed, he complains to the Lutheran consistory that he had had to take an immense amount of debt to pay off the cost of taking himself and his remaining furniture back across the sea to Turku. Nonetheless, he could be grateful for one thing. All of the investigators said that he had acted well, he had acted properly, he had acted according to expectations. They didn't really find him to fault. Where the Lutheran clergymen did find fault was they said that the tithe was too high for such a small community. It was creating poverty to pay this amount of agricultural produce every year. They certainly listened to the idea that was being mentioned just now, which was that the Lutheran figure, the Lutheran pastor should just be a religious figure rather than a government one. Excuse me. And they also complained really heavily about the Lighthouse Keeper. The Lighthouse Keeper, they said, was an incredibly drunk man, and his wife was even more drunk than the husband, apparently. And so they demanded, they said in their reports to their superiors, that the Lighthouse Keeper should be replaced with either an educated person or at least the sober one. But the major thing that for the islanders was that the clergymen promised them that they would not have to fund or work on rebuilding the parochial house, rebuilding the pastor's house on Vormsey. So in other words, the threat that Irlander had delivered had been diffused by the investigators who had promised, no, you're not going to have to rebuild it. And so, no, we're not going to send soldiers to make you rebuild it. Now, what was going on in the background with the Orthodox Church while all this was going ahead? Well, of course, as I already stated, Platon had ordered his clergy in Saaremaa to go to Ruhnu on the 25th of August to perform the rites of conversion. However, the local Orthodox clergy were having problems. Valdemanowski, who was the major figure in all of this, didn't have the time, or indeed it appears, the willingness to undertake the trip to Ruhnu and back. And all three of the priests, the Orthodox priests he asked, were unable or unwilling to do this job for various reasons. Some said that they were ill and provided doctor's notes to actually prove they were ill, or that they didn't have enough time, that they were busy visiting isolated places in their parishes, teaching in schools, etc., etc. Furthermore, in early September, news came from the island that they didn't want the visits of the Orthodox clergy at this particular time. Now, they said it was because most of their men had already departed to go seal hunting. However, as we've just seen, the reality was they were hosting the Lutheran investigators at the time, and in some extent negotiating with the Lutheran investigators. Now, the Orthodox Church then sat down and waited until the male islanders would return from their seal hunting, fishing, and trading, which did not really happen until May 1867. And they again sent a letter saying, well, do you still want to convert or not? They got a mixed response. Some said they still wanted to, others rejected the idea. So in the summer of 1867, Valdemanowski sent his psalmist, Nikolai Orlov, to the islands to visit, to get an understanding of what the conditions were on the island, and to see how the islanders regarded conversion at this point. Orlov, thankfully for us, Orlov actually wrote a diary about his experiences, which is maintained in the archival record. So his journey to Ruhnu took a week, 7 days. As you can see here, I'm giving you a quote about what he thought about this naval experience. All this voyage was extremely torturous, and with joy I jumped ashore. However, he was to find his time on the island not much more enjoyable than the sea trip had been. He was entirely alone during his time on the island. He lived with the Lighthouse Keeper in a spare room. He was sick with rheumatism, so sick that on one of the days of his visit, he could not leave because his joints felt so bad. And when he did leave his room to walk among the islanders, he had a distinctly unnerving experience. So, for instance, he said, "Children seeing me ran away, and women staring at me said not a word." So obviously Orlov, an outsider to this community, this very tight-knit, small community, had a great deal of difficulty penetrating it. Now, Orlov seems to have spoken Estonian for most of his visits to Ruhnu, but he had actually already been training to learn some Swedish. Obviously, he was being trained to become the priest of the island if they did indeed convert. And as you can see from the quote here, he got complimented for the quality of his Swedish. So he read the New Testament, so he read either New or the Old Testament. And he said, when the islanders asked him to read to them in Swedish, they told him that he read very well. Your pronunciation is even better than our former pastor, Irlanders. Of course, maybe that's not particularly a high compliment given how much they hated Irlander, but nonetheless showed that Orlov was certainly a gifted linguist, which his later career was also to prove. I beg your pardon. So here we see an archival copy of the diary that Orlov wrote in 1867. And this was a translation that he took with him of the liturgy of St. John of Chrysostom, which of course, as any Orthodox believer is aware, is a key liturgical text. I'm not entirely sure whether he did this translation himself or whether it was one that was already available that they made a copy of. But yes, they took this to the island. So I'm sorry, as you can tell, my voice is kind of going, so I might have to bring this a little bit, make this a little bit shorter.
That's all right. We also don't have any questions yet in the chat, so
Okay.
I think you will have at least a little bit of time to catch your breath before
All right, so
the
just
question
1
starts
second.
coming. So that's all right.
I can continue for a bit, I think, but let's see. So Olaf had 2 loins cap meetings summoned, and here the islanders revealed what their strategy had been the entire time, from sending the petitions to Valdomovsky on the 1st of May 1866 to this point. What they had done very cleverly had feigned a conversion to Orthodoxy to pressure the Lutheran Church to make concessions on the matter of the matter of getting rid of Irlander and on the paying for the Proper-House. So, in other words, to put it bluntly, the islanders had blackmailed the Lutheran authorities by saying, well, if we don't get these concessions, then we're going to convert to Orthodoxy. And when they got the concessions they wanted, then they no longer felt the need or desire to convert to Orthodoxy. So this is what Orlov writes. This is from Orlov's description of the loins cap meeting he attended. They never had the heartfelt desire to accept Orthodoxy. Due to their extreme situation, they were compelled to look for help, which they thought to find in Orthodoxy from the oppression of Lutheranism, or better, the Lutheran consistory, which was forcing them to build the pastoral house that Pastor Irlander allegedly burnt down on their own account. If they did not agree to build it, then the consistory threatened them with soldiers who would be sent to Ruhnu in order to punish them with sticks and otherwise torture them. But since they had received a document from the consistory with a state seal that announced they were liberated from the construction and any payments for it, then they desired to remain in Lutheranism as before. Now, just to be clear, this strategy wasn't universally popular among the islanders. Orlov pointed out that now they had rejected converting to Orthodoxy. This meant that the Lutheran consistory could simply then now start demanding things again. And some people agreed that they had actually were now sort of left without an option. Indeed, one islander, Ulrich Ullis, put things extremely strongly. He cursed Lutheranism, its pastors, and the consistory to the depths of hell. When the Germans learned that the Ibo folk were remaining in Lutheranism, then they would oppress them all the more. Now they, these devils, would demand dues and taxes for what no one knows and suck the islanders' blood. So clearly there was some quite strong opposition to rejecting Orthodoxy, to rejecting potentially the additional protection of the Imperial Russian government. However, these individuals were very few and far between. They were very few in number, and they were ultimately unwilling to act against the collective will expressed in the loins cap. So essentially, these individuals, although they privately stated their dissatisfaction with the decision to reject Orthodoxy, in public they fell into line and backed the public, their communal decision. So just to conclude then, what came out of this bizarre small instant on this unknown and remote part of, in this remote and unknown part of Estonia? Well, it should go without saying that Ruhnu remained, the Ruhnu and its islanders remained Lutheran until the departure of the Estonian Swedes from Estonia in 1944. In the short term, there was no pastor on Ruhnu until 1871. The Lutheran Church does not seem to have been able to find a replacement for quite a few years after the entire incident. possibly linked with knowledge about how difficult the experiences of Irlander had been on the island. Now, the Russian Orthodox Church would also seem to have come out of this empty-handed. However, for Orlov, this was not to be his last encounter with the Swedish Ibo folk, or the last time that he had to speak Swedish as part of his religious duties. In 1886, much later, in the wake of another conversion wave, mostly in the coastal area of Estland province, Orlov was dispatched to become the Orthodox priest among the Ibo folk of the island of Vormsi. And this experiment lasted much, much longer, with Orthodoxy, lasted much, much longer than that in Ruhnu. Indeed, the Orthodox parish on Vormsi lasted into the 1930s. Now, some things to just take away in general from this talk. Although it's tempting to see Ruhnu as being a place that was more difficult to live than in Africa, as the Lutheran priest we quoted at the beginning of this presentation said, it was in fact deeply influenced and connected by developments on the Estonian mainland and elsewhere in the Baltic. Clearly, the people on Ruhnu understood the developments in the world around them and were able to use those developments to their own advantage. And here is one of the sort of major takeaways of this entire instance, was just how cleverly this group of supposedly ignorant, supposedly backward islanders were able to manipulate both the Lutheran and Orthodox churches to get rid of a threat to their beloved independence and autonomy, to remove a priest who had become a burden to them, and to reduce the risk of outside interference into their affairs. In other words, to reduce or remove the risk that Russian soldiers might show up, as they had done on Vormsi a few years prior. So in other words, the Ruhnu Islanders, far from being a backwards and remote community, were in fact deeply connected with developments in Estland and were very clever in manipulating institutions to suit their own benefits. And with that, I think I will finish and leave it open to your questions. Thank you very much. Oh, and these are my two publications on this matter, which you can find some more. You can find some more details. So there's one in English, and there's also one in Russian, which you can hear, where you'll find more details of what I was talking about today.
Well, yeah, thank you so much. I enjoyed your lecture immensely, and I'll let you catch your breath for a little bit. But I also have a question, although we have a question in the chat as well. So my understanding of all of the conditions is about as deep as probably the Islanders was, or even shallower. I didn't quite get from the lecture, were the Islanders correct in their understanding that the taxation from the Orthodox Church was going to be smaller or non-existent, and wouldn't they be still obliged to take care of the pastor if the Orthodox pastor would have come? Or was it just a mistake of their understanding?
It was an inaccurate understanding. They might not have had to pay as much to the pastor, to the Orthodox priest, if one had arrived, because it is almost certain that the Orthodox priest who would have been sent there would have been given a salary by the imperial state. But they would have still had to provide some kind of, they would have had to provide a farm for him. He would have had to have land. He probably would have had, and they would have had to provide at least payments for different services, so different rituals. This was typically what happened with other Orthodox clergy, both in Estland and in the rest of the Russian, Estland, Livland, and the rest of the Russian Empire. Whether it would have been as much as the tithe they were paying, which even the Lutheran investigators in 1866, 1867 said was astonishingly high, they really say this is ridiculously high. There are parishes with thousands of people on the mainland who are paying less than these 330 people on this island are paying, I think it probably would have been less, but they would have still had to make some kind of payments.
Sure. So the next question will come from the audience, and they are asking, did the Orthodox Church have any concrete plans in place if Ruhnu would convert? Or was it viewed by with pessimism from the beginning?
So the idea was, when the three investigators went from Kulisale, I'm sorry, I'm not totally sure how to pronounce it. And they were supposed to evaluate the area to see what plans they could come up with. And there was an idea that if an Orthodox parish would be set up there, they would set it up in or near the lighthouse, and it would basically be, the Orthodox Church would be essentially a prayer house, essentially within this building. That had been their initial plan, and then maybe in the future there would have been plans to build a Orthodox church. Of course, a proper church, I mean, rather than just a prayer house where they rented a room from, say, the Lighthouse Keeper or whoever. Of course, this was a problem elsewhere in the Baltic provinces, where it took, in some cases, decades for the Orthodox Church to move out of small rented apartments or rented peasants' apartments, basically, into fully constructed stone or wooden Orthodox churches. But there were certainly some plans that were set down. They didn't completely dismiss the idea and that they were going to actually become Orthodox. Indeed, they seem to have believed so when they left the island, that there was a good chance they would become Orthodox. There wasn't necessarily, I don't think there was necessarily pessimism at that point, although certainly in 1867 there was much more. When Orlov visited, they were very much in doubt whether the entire thing would go ahead.
Yeah, that was understandable. Yeah, but there is a next question. I'm not sure I understand, but maybe you will understand it better. A new Lutheran church was built beside the beautiful wooden one. Were there questions about funding and obligations of the islanders to pay for the new church? Were there objections to additional fees, or did the church learn from this previous financial dispute?
So as far as I can see, I'm not sure about the. I have no idea about the construction of the new church you see in the picture to begin with. I'm afraid I'm not entirely sure when it was built, or on what basis it was built. Thank you. Okay, you provided the date. I haven't seen any documents about this in regards to Ruhnu. Most of my research on Ruhnu has been focused on this earlier period, but maybe this would be something interesting to investigate. Certainly, I do have some files from that period, which I haven't got around to yet. I'm not entirely sure whether they would have learnt from the question or not. Certainly, I think a lot of what the investigators wrote in their final report had the strength of a recommendation. And certainly they could say all they want. They could say, for instance, well, the pastor should be a religious official and someone else should take on the secular duties. Well, they could say that if they wanted, but in the Russian Empire, all clergy of all confessions had to do some kind of state duties and were indeed invaluable connections between the government and the people. So certainly that recommendation was not going to be followed up on by anybody in the imperial government or the higher echelons of the Russian Empire's Lutheran Church, for instance.
Yeah, well, but also very interesting question that also came to my mind. Why, in your opinion, the conversion went smoothly for Swedish community on the island of Vormsi?
Well, I'm in the process of publishing some articles about the conversion of Vormsi right now, and it would be interesting, of course, to do a talk on them. It didn't go that smoothly, I can say, but certainly the problem on Vormsi was it was a much larger community. It was over 2,000 people, and only a quarter or so of the people decided to convert on Vormsi, and it was the subject of inter-community disputes very deep community disputes. Why was it much more successful? I would probably say the Orthodox Church reacted much more quickly in the case of Wormsey. They didn't wait almost a year, to send somebody to check up on it. They immediately sent somebody to perform the so-called rites of conversion, the rites of joining to the group on Wormsey who wanted to join almost immediately after they learned of their intention. So they very quickly confirmed and started the parish there. And of course, this was in the 1886 when you not only have the conversions in Western Estland going on, but also the Russian provincial government at the time is heavily invested in processes of Russification and was heavily interested in what was going on on Wormsey, and actively spent quite a lot of money and time getting land for the church, building a very nice church very quickly, building and setting up schools very quickly. So I'd probably say the answer is, well, it didn't go that smoothly, but in this case, the Orthodox Church reacted very quickly, and they had heavy and interested support from the imperial state in the case of Wormsey.
So there was much more effort put into it, it seems like. But again, connected to this question is my question. Do you think that community on Wormsey was much more sincere in their attempts to convert than it was on Ruhnu, or there was you don't see any difference? It's just the amount of effort was put from another side, from the Orthodox Church.
Well, this question of sincerity and insincerity is very difficult to sort of clarify, especially because often we have the sources. I should be clear from the sources I use here. We don't really ever hear the islanders speak for themselves or write for themselves. These are what educated outsiders are writing about them, about how they think. And the same happens on Wormsey, really, in the 1880s. Almost immediately after the parish of Wormsey is opened in 1886, there are really big questions about how sincere are these people, because immediately there starts to be mass rejections of orthodoxy in the parish. Depends on which source you use. Some government sources say about 50 to 60 people. A few others say 200, which would have been almost half the group of people who wanted to convert. So obviously they weren't necessarily more sincere. It was just the case that the Russian Orthodox Church reacted much more quickly in the case of Wormsey than they did in the case of Ruhnu, where there were various obstacles. As I mentioned, it was the case that it was difficult to find someone who would go, and the islanders themselves contributed to confusion by saying, well, our men have vanished, they've gone hunting seals, fishing, whatever in the sea, so they're not here to accept conversion, so why send somebody? This doesn't happen on Wormsey. They basically, within a month or two, send the priest to do the joining ritual. And then afterwards, well, of course, the problem is, after the conversion, well, it doesn't really matter how sincerely Orthodox they were or not, because imperial Russian law forbade apostasy from Orthodoxy. So it was a crime to leave the Orthodox confession if you were Orthodox. So 200 people could say they wanted to leave, but according to imperial law, that was not allowed. It was a criminal act.
Didn't know that, but that's very good to know in those kinds of questions. I don't know if you will be able to answer the next question, but because it's not your time period and not really related to Swedish community in Estonia. So one listener asks, additional question, not actually related to Swedish community in Estonia, but to United Estonian Speaking Orthodox Community of Estonia with the Catholic Church, to make some unitary church like Ukrainian Greek Catholic community. It was the plan of the president of Estonia, Konstantin Päts, in the end of the 1930s. So I don't see the question here. So maybe is it like, was there an effort, or or do you know anything about it?
I'm afraid this is, I know I know a bit about the history of the Orthodox Church in the interwar period. I'm afraid it's not my specialism at all. I think it would be better if you were to. I believe my colleague Irina Payets is going to give a lecture in this series, and she would be the much better person to ask this question. She has much more expertise on this time period than I do.
So yeah, follow us, follow Narva Museum on Facebook. We'll give announcement about further lectures and their themes, and maybe something will interest you, or maybe the whole series will interest you and you will attend, all of you. So I think we'll conclude our lecture with this. And yeah, thank you so much once again, James. It was a great pleasure to listen. It really read like, I don't know, a fiction book, like an anecdote almost. So I enjoyed that immensely, and thank you so much. And to every listener, thank you so much for attending. And yeah, have a lovely evening. Bye bye.